These are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon or morning, depending on what time zone you're in. Thank you for joining us for the November installment of ILA's Leadership Perspectives webinar series, Exploring Distance in Leader-Follower Relationships. I am Rusty Ricketson, Associate Professor of Leadership at Luther Rice University, and I'm going to be moderating this webinar with Michelle Bligh and Ron Riggio today. Before we start, let me give you a few reminders. First of all, this webinar will be archived. If you missed something and would like to hear the webinar again or would like to see the presentation again, they'll be published to the ILA website shortly. You'll receive an email with instructions for accessing the archived recording after the webinar has ended. Second, we welcome your questions throughout the webinar. At any time, you may ask questions by typing them into the questions box of your webinar control panel, which is currently displayed on the right-hand side of your screen. We will address your questions during the second portion of the webinar. However, please note that we may not be able to address each question as we receive so many during the webinars, but please, by all means, ask your questions or give comments. So without further ado, let me introduce our presenters today. Michelle Bligh is an Associate Professor in the School of Behavioral and Organizational Sciences and the Drucker Ito School of Management at Claremont Graduate University. She also serves on the editorial review boards of the Leadership Quarterly and Leadership. Ron Riggio is the Henry R. Kravis Professor of Leadership and Organizational Psychology and former director of the Kravis Leadership Institute at Claremont McKenna College. Both Michelle and Ron have co-edited a book, Distance in Leader-Follower Relations, and without any further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Michelle, and look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rusty. Welcome, everyone. Ron and I are very pleased to have you all joining us today. This book has been a very interesting journey, I think, for both of us, and so I'm pleased to welcome you along part of it today. I may not be exaggerating to state that the landscape of our organizations is changed forever as the spectrum of leader-follower relations is getting infinitely more complex. Leaders today may be radically separated or intimately close to followers, both physically, socially, and psychologically, and all of these forms of distance can and do interact with one another. As a result, as leadership scholars and practitioners, we are challenged to reevaluate the extent to which our theories and our practices are impacted by these factors such as geographic distance, virtuality, and modality of interaction. So distance, we argue in the book, is not merely an attribute of one type of team or organization, as in virtual teams or virtual organizations, but is inherent in all of the leadership contexts that we face to a greater or lesser degree. So as we go through today, I want to warn you that the book has some answers, but for me it has raised a lot more important questions for us as leaders as we move into a changing 21st century. So I'm going to take you through today 20 or 30 minutes of some of the highlights in my mind of the book, starting with some of the historical perspectives on distance from the first chapter of the book, moving into defining modern concepts of distance. What does it mean for us today as we face increasing technology and globalization? And then I'll cover some of the broad advantages as well as disadvantages of distance for leaders and followers. And then conclude with pointing you to some aspects of the book that point out practical implications for leaders who are confronting both challenges and advantages of leading from a distance. So to start with a brief history of what distance is, scholars and philosophers have long recognized and debated how space and time and distance fundamentally shape both our notions of who we are as well as how we relate to one another. Early definitions emphasized that distance was socially constructed and ultimately shaped by how much one social class or one race actually attempted to imitate the other. In 1924, Park outlined the concept of distance as distinguished from spatial relations, quote, in an attempt to reduce to something like measurable terms the grades and degrees of intimacy which characterize personal and social relationships. So somewhat ironically, these early definitions highlighted the importance of personal and social distance rather than focusing on geographic or spatial distance. It was in 1925 that Emery Bogardus first published his social distance scale, which asked people, quote, the extent to which they would willingly admit members of each race to a given social situation, such as into the country via immigration or into the family via marriage. But he also introduced for the first time the idea of differentiating between vertical distance and horizontal distance. Vertical distance being defined by differences in achievement between individuals unique from rank or position, although he recognized rank and position do help to create and magnify social distance. He also defined horizontal distance as the activity of those in equal or relatively equal social rank. So up until the 1920s, distance was primarily emphasized by race, class, and differences in social standing. But from that historical background, I think we can see vestiges of those in our modern definitions of distance. These definitions are from Miriam Webster, who points out that the use of the word distance dates back to the 14th century, and there are four nuances of distance that make up our modern usage of the term. These include a separation in time, the quality or state of being distant, as in spatial remoteness, personal or emotional separation, and difference or disparity, a distant point or region, as well as aesthetic distance and the capacity to observe dispassionately. And I want to take you through each of these and have us think about how each of them has marked and fundamental impacts on the practice and study of leadership today. So the first definition of distance as a separation in time really highlights that at the most basic level, distance shapes how and to what degree we can and do interact with others. At the more complex level, changing notions of distance and technology are literally morphing our relationships and spheres of influence at a rapidly increasing pace. So technology today renders some separations of time and space less meaningful as we analyze the details of fallen dictatorships and changing governments from locations all around the globe. It's now very clear that leaders can influence followers and followers can influence other followers around the globe somewhat independently of our separation in space and time. But the second definition of distance is also very relevant for leadership, which is the quality or state of being distant. Paradoxically, technology modifies and enhances other types of distance, as we often hear parents and managers alike bemoaning their waning influence on followers and children who are turning to smartphones and social media rather than to formal leaders for their daily guidance. So leaders are now competing with the ability to influence followers, as represented by the lower right picture of the woman shouting out into space-time over her microphone on the beach. So given these radical shifts in what distance means for our leaders and our relationships, it's perhaps surprising that the domain of leadership has for the most part, really ignored distance altogether. And as we started to put together the book, we realized that the majority of leadership theories either implicitly or explicitly suggest it doesn't really matter how often, across what distances, or through what media leaders and followers interact. So one of the primary purposes of the book is to establish the topic of distance as both a new approach to leadership and as an important context for all of our leadership relationships and theories. And it essentially requires a retesting and reevaluation of much of what we think we know or have believed that we know in past leadership contexts. So let me move to the third element of our modern definition of distance, and that is of a distant point or region. And I think two recent trends really illustrate how the notion of geographic distance is fundamentally changing. For example, the number of Americans who are working from home now has soared 41% in the last decade alone. About 13.4 million people currently work from home in the U.S., according to a Census Bureau report from October of this year. That's about 4 million more Americans since 1999 alone. And this trend is really being driven by the availability of high-speed internet, Skype, that allow for at-home virtual meetings and making work from home easier, as well as the recent challenging economic landscape, which has forced employers to cut back on costs, such as office expenses, and let people work remotely. Even as the economy starts to pick back up, there's evidence that this trend of people working from home is only going to increase. And the number of people who work from home at least one day a week in the U.S. has increased to just under 10% of all workers in 2010. The second trend that I think is similarly changing the landscape of space or geographic distance between leaders and followers is that our distant retreats, our summer vacations, our escape from work and the sphere of leaders' influence is losing a lot of its meaning. In a July 2012 survey by the Harris Poll, they looked at 1,309 employed Americans. 52% said that they will work during their summer vacation this year, and that's up 6 percentage points from last year. And of respondents who were employed full, part-time, or self-employed, 30% expected to read work-related emails on vacation, 23% were taking work-related phone calls, and perhaps most relevant for our purposes, 13% expected to be asked to do work by a boss on their vacation. So interestingly, all of these trends point to, in some cases, the increasing sphere of influence for hierarchical leaders into our homes as we work from home increasingly, and also into our vacations as we're expected to work as we play on vacation. And finally, the fourth definition of modern distance, the aesthetic distance, or the capacity to observe dispassionately, has some important implications for leaders as well. This element foreshadows some of the advantages of distance that Shamir talks about in his chapter in our book. More specifically, distance may be needed for leaders to maintain detachment from their daily operational details. It may allow them to obtain a broader perspective on organizational situations, to prioritize, to think strategically, to step away and identify longer-term needs, opportunities, articulate long-term vision, and make longer-term plans. So this ability to observe dispassionately or be separate from followers and organizational contexts can provide some benefits to leaders as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about those in a few moments. So all of these really bring us to the modern academic definition of distance, which many of the chapters of the book really used as a stepping off point, and that is Napier and Ferris's conception of leader-follower distance as social distance, as functional distance, and as physical distance. And you can see there are vestiges of all of these historical and modern definitions sort of sprinkled throughout their approach. Psychological distance includes that demographic distance, hearkening to our historical definitions, power distance between leaders and followers, perceived similarity in values between leaders and followers, and as well as that value similarity. Structural distance, on the other hand, includes both the physical distance as well as the amount of interaction that leaders and followers have, the span of control. And then finally, the functional distance in the middle of the graph draws from leader-member exchange theory in really defining distance depending on whether or not the follower is in the in-group or the out-group, whether or not they see eye to eye with one another in terms of perceptual congruence, and the degree of autonomy or latitude provided to the follower in their work. And all of these sort of bound up in that idea of relationship quality that is similar to LMX. So in the book, I won't touch on some of the other factors that influence leader-follower distance, which include cultural differences, gender differences in Alice Eagley's chapter, in-group, out-group differences in Michael Hogg's chapter, as well as hierarchical level of the organization, which we've talked a little bit about already. And finally, I just want to outline 3 assumptions of leader-follower distance that in some ways all of the chapters really touch on in some ways. And that is that distance assumes some level of commonality between leaders and followers, meaning that leaders and followers can be more or less distant in relation to the same organization, perhaps the same profession, perhaps in relation to the hierarchy, the country, the geographic location, or even we can refer to distance within the context of the global community today. Also, that distance in and of itself is behaviorally independent. It doesn't imply any positive or negative affects or outcomes. In other words, distance is not in and of itself a good or a bad. It's a how, it's a to what extent, it's with what advantages and disadvantages, and in other words, it's a context rather than a causal. So leaders and followers, dyads with the same degree of social distance may have very fundamentally different relationships, positive and negative, and outcomes, positive and negative. So distance is not inherently good or bad. And that finally, distance is measured not only by magnitude, but also direction in a comparison. So it has both of those horizontal and vertical, those spatial and social dimensions when we talk about distance between leaders and followers. So one of the primary questions that the book really addresses and raises for all of us is, what will leadership look like in 20 years as these changing leader-follower contexts are morphing through technology and globalization? And I obviously don't have time to go into all of it, but what I wanted to do was just briefly highlight some of the technology 2012 challenges that I believe our leadership theory and practice needs to address more proactively. The first is technology 2012 is about equity. This is a United Nations report from last fall stating that internet access is now a basic human right. And in the report, the United Nations quote, "Given that the internet has become an indispensable tool for realizing a range of human rights, combating inequality, and accelerating development and human progress, ensuring universal access to the internet should be a priority for all states." So in some ways we can look at this as the rise of the follower, in the sense that the internet has become an equalizer, and that the United Nations is promoting equity for everyone to have this as a basic human right. However, we can also look to recent trends. Next week, the UN is actually meeting in Dubai to discuss regulating the internet. And so we see also the rise of the formal hierarchy, the bureaucracy, in an attempt to control and regulate the equitable access to technology. So that will be a trend for us to watch. Another technology 2012 trend that I think is important, again, an equity free access to all. This is a free Wi-Fi hotspot that's beaming broadband internet from atop a public phone booth in Manhattan. And New York City has launched a pilot program to provide free public Wi-Fi and public phone booths around the 5 boroughs. So again, equity, Technology 2012 is also a focus on equality. This is some images from projects like Fab5 in Afghanistan and Kenya, which are finding inexpensive ways to provide internet access to remote and rural locations. A couple of other trends. Over the last 5 years, developing countries have increased their share of the world's total number of internet users from 44% to 62%. Today, internet users in China are almost 25% of the world's total internet users. And by 2015, internet user penetration should reach 60% worldwide, 50% in developing countries. So technology in 2012 is about equity, it's about ubiquity, it's literally everywhere. It's also about the next generation of followers that leaders are going to be interacting with and are really developing our next generation of leadership. 45% of the world's internet users are under 25. It's about mobility, 6 billion mobile cell subscriptions currently and growing, so people connecting all over the world. And it's also about social media and the individual. And I think these are very important for formal and informal leadership influence. 75% of today's data on the internet is created by individuals. Every minute, 72 hours of video is uploaded via YouTube. So all of these trends are really fundamentally changing the way leaders are interacting with followers, as well as the ways followers can interact with one another and influence leaders. So one of the big sort of themes that we address in the book is what we call the distance dilemma, which is distance functional? Is it futile? Is it inevitable? And just to give you some of the highlights of some of the themes that we talk about within the book, the allure of distant charismatic leaders. Historically, distance was thought to be essential for leaders to maintain follower influence and respect, and early research supported this perspective. The old adage, a leader is only good as his strongest fault, makes sense of this perspective in some ways by illustrating that leaders are often judged based on daily decisions and character. And so distance can be functional in that it increases the allure, the fascination with distant charismatic leaders. And some of our theories within leadership, in addition to charisma, the heroic leader or hero worship, the romance of leadership perspective, fundamentally do argue that distance is a functional and necessary component of those styles of leadership. But then we also talk about some of the negative influences of and effects of distance. This is, here I'll highlight some of David Collinson's work that basically distance in his case study of two comparative organizations acted to diminish trust within the organization and led to, or at least partially led to, the construction of countercultures in the organization. So employees in his research perceived distant leaders to be too far removed from daily operations, leading them to question the leader's ability to make strategic decisions about daily operations, and the lack of trust also led them to question what was going on behind the scenes or what they couldn't see in high distance contexts. So Collinson in this work concludes that mistrust and workplace deviance could have been avoided had the leadership team narrowed the distance gap by being more communicative and transparent. So we see here some of the dysfunctional aspects of leader-follower distance. And then finally, I think throughout the book there's a theme of distance as an inevitable reality. Our changing workplace and some of the technological themes that I briefly went through have really made the likelihood of living in a different geographic location or a different hierarchical location from one's leader an inevitable reality that all leaders really have to address and face. So in looking at distant leadership in Shamir's chapter, he really argues that followers in distant leadership situations, followers look towards leaders' accomplishments and goals as a reference point, and that perceptions of leaders tend to be much more general, they tend to be abstract, they tend to be much less nuanced. In contrast, leaders up close, followers look for information about a leader's honesty, about how fair they are or open they are, even whether or not they have a sense of humor in daily interactions, and that perceptions of leaders in close contexts tend to be much more detailed, more specific, and much more nuanced. And so in the Shamir chapter, he really argues that distance is something that is created by both leaders and followers in the leadership relationship, that leaders and followers construct a level of distance between them. Leaders sometimes use distance to their advantage and sometimes to their disadvantage. He notes that distance is frequently viewed as an obstacle to communication, an obstacle to being individualized in your consideration of followers, an obstacle to providing opportunities for leaders to engage in role modeling, in guidance, and in individualized coaching. However, he also points that distance offers important benefits. It lets leaders hide mistakes and errors, failures and weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Thus, they are able to maintain a more clean and positive image in followers' eyes. Distance may also increase followers' acceptance of leaders because of that cleaner image and enhance the prestige and authority of the leader. He argues that distance allows leaders to reflect, to recharge their batteries, to get that needed perspective and objectivity from the daily realities of organizational life that we saw in the last definition of leadership, or excuse me, of distance in the teddy bear looking at the royal wedding. And finally, Shamir notes that some of the effects of leadership behavior may be enhanced by distance, such as when leaders make a particularly charismatic speech, inner follower processes become more important and relevant, and distance may enhance autonomy and independence of followers, which is arguably an important step for developing follower capabilities and leadership capacity in others. I also want to just briefly mention that Surinder Kahai's chapter also talks about ways in which IT technology is increasing distance, such as by introducing anonymity into organizational communications and leader-follower communications, and by letting organizations distribute workers around the globe. So in some ways, the technology of IT is enhancing that distance. In other cases, it's decreasing it. And he talks about bringing like-minded individuals together from around the globe, so really shrinking that distance, and by letting organizations tap into resources that are outside of their boundaries. So in summary, I would say, the take-home point is that distance is a context that is both advantageous, disadvantageous, and inevitable, and it can be functional, it can be dysfunctional, but it is definitely an incredibly important context for all leader-follower relations. And just in closing, I want to point to the Riker chapter in which they argue that there are some specific ways in which distant leaders can keep employees engaged. And so in the Riker chapter, they offer some specific guidelines for how distance leaders can design meaningful and motivating work via technology or via less intense interactions with their followers, how leaders can support and coach employees from a distance, how leaders can best enhance employees' personal resources from a distance, and how they can facilitate rewarding and supportive coworker relationships from a distance. So overall, to me, and I hope for Ron too, the book raises some really important and meaningful questions for leaders as in the 21st century, and for me has really highlighted important questions such as how will we lead in 20 years and what will that look like, and how will we lead in 50 years and what will that look like, and perhaps even more importantly, how well are we preparing our leaders for tomorrow for the complex array of both close and distant contexts in which they will inevitably lead. So I point you to the book for if any of these comments or thoughts have struck a chord with you. There's obviously a lot more detail in the chapters in the book, but what I'd like to do is to open it up to your questions and a little bit more interactive discussion about the role of distance in leader-follower relations. So I will hand it back to Rusty.
Well, thank you, Michelle. And we do have some questions available to us. Before I get to the questions, though, Ron, do you have anything you'd like to add or a point that you would like to specifically address?
Sure. Just a couple more things that are in the book. There are a couple case studies that close the book and talk about how specific leaders have used distance and the issues around distance for those leaders. And it's kind of interesting because the chapters deal with, the first one deals with Steve Jobs. That's Ronan Kark's chapter. And we sort of see Steve Jobs as kind of a, prototypical strong business leader. He's probably still, the most popular business leader. And then Ed Hollander, who has been thinking about the issue of leaders and followers and the distance issue for decades, has an excellent chapter on Barack Obama. And so those two chapters allow us to kind of look at it from a kind of an individual perspective and see how distance works both advantageously and disadvantageously for a business leader and for a political leader.
All right, well, thank you. We have a question that basically addresses our relationship as scholars, and the question is basically, could we, through ILA, also examine a relationship between the social actor and the investigator studying them? I guess we're taking a look at ourselves. This particular person says, I would think the same basic considerations might apply. How close or remote is the leadership scholar in this distance relationship?
Wow. Great question.
That is a great. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think that it brings that concept of distance down to kind of the professional level. And I think historically, if we look at, for example, let's take physicians. Physicians often have to develop a kind of distance from their patients, anybody in healthcare, because and it's related to you don't want to be too empathic with them. So I think that there's this issue at the professional level of, how close do we get to people that we're serving in our profession. And I think from a researcher perspective, I think we've often maintained a distance from our participants, and in fact in psychology we've sort of changed the term subjects to participants, partly because the subjects was a pejorative term. But I think what we try to do is because we try to maintain distance because we know that our behavior as experimenters or as researchers can influence the responses that we get. So I think that there's a kind of a functional aspect to distance that each and every one of us, regardless of what we do in our jobs, that we have to maintain from kind of a professional orientation.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent response, Ron, and I was glad you brought up the physician example because I don't know if you caught that, I think it was in the paper last week that in the UK they're now piloting physician-patient visits via Skype. So looking at how we can use technology to enhance that relationship, but I think it does also have a real functional element in that that distance is maintained, that you are able to look at the patient in a somewhat objective, distant manner, and that in part all of our leader-follower relations do utilize distance, for that functional purpose. And I would also add that I am really glad you brought up the change from subject to participant, because part of the reason I went into the historical definitions of distance is I do think that we shouldn't lose that social class, that element of prestige, which is often embedded in the concept of distance. And I think that when we study anything, that those class and or prestige relationships become front and center as we're asking people for information that we're then using and reporting back in a scientific way to a larger community. So I think those those issues of class and prestige, we try to minimize them in more modern contexts, but they're still there, and we need to be mindful of the way that distance is used to, in some ways, enhance them. The last thing I would add is just, when I talked about all of the trends in technology, making it more ubiquitous, more equitable, really, maybe in some ways glorified, in that there are a lot of individuals throughout the world that still don't have access to that technology, and how do we lead effectively in cases when we have people that are very connected versus we are still dealing with people from older generations that are not always technologically savvy and have a lot of information and knowledge that we still need to capitalize on.
All right. Well, another question for each of you is, you mentioned that technology introduced the element of anonymity to the leader-follower relationship. Mm-hmm. How has this element affected leadership practice, and what do leaders need to do differently to address this new factor?
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Michelle, and
okay.
I've got a couple practitioner-oriented points, but you go ahead if you want to.
Okay. I would. That comes from, as I mentioned, the Surrender Kahai's chapter, and I can talk a little bit about. I think that in some ways, I was just talking about class and prestige and the difference between leaders and followers, and in some ways, that anonymity, I think, can act to balance that power difference in some way. And I'm specifically thinking of, anonymous blogs where followers are able to give feedback to leaders, to CEOs, to top managers in a relatively safe environment in ways that may not have been possible without the technology to sort of mediate that. So I think in that way, leaders have the challenge and maybe the opportunity of getting feedback from a lot richer and more variety of sources that they may not have had access to in the past. And we often bemoan the fact that that information is often filtered more and more as you move up the hierarchy. And I think in some ways we could do a better job of utilizing technology to sort of mitigate that that problem that we talk about in terms of upward filtering of information. But I don't know, Ron, you said you had some more practical elements to add.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about I was thinking back to a week-long training that we did years ago, and it was ostensibly it was sort of team building. It was from kind of a leadership perspective, But these were employees who were pretty much working virtually at the time. I mean, they were often very small offices, 1 or 2 employees located. They were international, but primarily across the United States. And we brought them all together for this workshop. And for many of them, they had been working together for years, but it was the first time they actually met face to face. And I remember thinking about that, about the opportunity to better understand what are the needs of the virtual workers in terms of their ability to interact with one another, because we saw really transformative kinds of things where people who were working together actually gained insights into the other person's motivation because they got to meet them face to face, and it just really enhanced the operations. So I think there's I think that we need to think more about distance, because obviously when we were doing that, I wasn't thinking formally about the issues of distance, and we could have probably addressed that. But I think there are great opportunities here for leadership practitioners to help ease the transition or deal with this issue of balance between what are the strengths, what are the drawbacks to distance, and how can we make people work together who are primarily working virtually or working a great deal of the time virtually. How can we enhance their performance as a team, and of course the leader-follower relationship? So I think there's huge opportunities here. So I kind of wanted to throw that out for the practitioners, because our book is fairly academic, but I think there's lots of implications here for practice.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, I didn't really touch too much on the Antonakis and Jakar chapter, where they talk about, it's titled The Far Side of Leadership, Rather Difficult to Face, and they talk about really some of our leadership selection biases, and how as followers, we tend to judge leaders, particularly in higher distance situations, by basic heuristics such as similarity, representativeness, how leader-like someone looks. And I think that has huge implications for us as we move into this more anonymous mediated world, in the sense that if we can utilize technology to mitigate some of those biases, meaning I'm not judging someone's leadership by how tall they are, how deep their voice is, or how leader-like they look, but actually how well they're able to coach me, role model me, inspire me, direct me. And I think in some ways technology can perhaps free us from some of those biases, because we can interact with people as people rather than as their heuristics of what they look like. And in this case, I'm thinking of some of the work companies are doing with interacting via avatar versus actual video. And so I don't know how far out these ideas are, but I think that there's potential there for perhaps using that anonymous function to help counteract some of our basic human fallacies in how we judge leaders, rate leaders, and select leaders.
Well, while we're on that practitioner type of line of questioning, we do have a couple of folks that are asking questions related to that. One mentioning that in the coaching industry, it's relied very much on the distant contact versus the face-to-face. And is there a perspective on the trade-offs of this distance type of leadership relationship? And then also looking at more practical steps that perhaps leaders can take to better deal with the realities of distance.
Okay. It sounds like there were sort of 2 questions in there.
There were 2 questions,
okay.
Really. One was based on the coaching side, and the distance contact versus the face-to-face, and what are the trade-offs there. And then this other question was looking for some more maybe practical steps, perhaps, that are mentioned in the book with regard to how to deal with the realities of the distance between leaders and followers.
You want to,
okay.
Michelle, you want to handle the first one, and then maybe I can talk on the second one in terms of practical.
Sure. I think that a lot of the, particularly in the coaching context, we didn't have any chapters that specifically address that context. But I think that a lot of the research on the advantages and disadvantages of distance versus face-to-face would be incredibly relevant for the coaching context. And those are some of those ideas that it's in a face-to-face context, you're more able to influence people based on nuance, based on that overtime relationship that's built up, more of the LMX style of interaction between coach and coachee, versus from a distance, a distant or more mediated context, you're working more with less nuanced aspects of behavior, and the type of influence process, at least from Shamir's work, is going to be more focused on vision, crafting vision. It's going to be more focused on how the leader's persona comes across, about how the leader presents him or herself, about how the leader highlights his or her accomplishments in the past and goals in the future, because those are the elements that are going to be highlighted in a more distant relationship. So it's really, as Shamir calls it, it's working on crafting that clean and positive image, and hopefully an authentic way in the distant context, versus crafting more of the nuances of perceptions of honesty and fairness and sense of humor and trust and really bidirectional influence that happens in the closer context. So I think those broader research findings that Shamir covers in this chapter are very relevant to the coaching context in that the influence processes are likely to be different, and also the elements of leadership that you're more likely to focus on in the close versus distant context.
In terms of sort of practitioner strategies, I was talking to Brett Anderson, who was the former CEO of Best Buy, and one of the programs, and you can really sort of see this more as sort of empowering the followers, but he realized that essentially at Best Buy stores all across the country, the employees were developing their own ideas about, you know, customer service and best practices. And so what he established were a set of wikis that the employees generated, where they could share what they were doing in the specific stores. And so there's actually a video you can find about a woman who was in customer service and came up with this wiki that allowed them to, you know, essentially improve the process for people when they got their equipment home, how to set it up and that kind of thing. And so he was using the technology to create closeness among people in this very large organization that were doing the same kind of job. So I think there are ways to use the technology to bring employees closer together and to allow them to interact with one another, where the leader can step back and really empower the followers to take charge, to take the leadership. And so I think that there's huge advantages here, but we have to be innovative and creative.
All right. Along that same line, or similar line, a question is asked. You mentioned a few ways that leaders can use distance to their advantage. How can followers benefit from the same distance?
Oh, that's a really good question. Do you want to take a stab, Ron, or do you?
No, go ahead, Michelle. It sounds like you've got a sense.
Well, one of the aspects of the book that I was really intrigued by was this idea of how distance can help followers get sort of the space, or in some ways the freedom and autonomy to try things out, to make mistakes, to engage in some inner follower learning, to really try and risk in ways that they might not be able to do if they were co-located with a leader, where they were concerned that the leader would be, you know, judging missteps or punishing mistakes, or really not allowing the follower to take advantage of learning from failure. So I think that followers can use distance to capture some autonomy and independence, and in some ways that can be very beneficial. Then the flip side of that is obviously that it really necessitates a follower that has enough confidence, has enough resources, and has enough sense of engagement that they are willing and able to take those risks. And so I'm thinking more of, obviously, knowledge workers, creative teams, innovation kinds of practices, where I think that having some distance between leaders and followers can be really advantageous for the followers, because they can then sort of go off and do and try and learn, and then bring what they've learned and what some of those trials and tribulations to the leader selectively, without having the leader micromanaging the process. And I just also am always reminded of a lot of employee surveys consistently show that one of the most problems they have in the workplace is micromanagement of their supervisor. And if you think about it, distance can be used by followers in ways to sort of it's harder to be micromanaged when you're working from home. It's harder to be micromanaged when you are working with colleagues co-located away from the leader's sphere of influence. So I really do think that in many ways distance does equalize the playing field between leaders and followers, and give followers some of that freedom to experience and explore and make mistakes.
If I may follow up with that and just say that is in the distance dynamic, are we not talking about an assumption that's made on the part of the follower or the leader as to what the leader or the follower is, or who they are, or their level of trust, or their level of character, if we don't see them face to face?
Well, I mean, if you look at very large organizations or in politics, clearly, I mean, we just went through an election. Clearly, politicians have to go out and sort of, as they say, press the flesh a little bit and allow that opportunity for people to see them face to face. But pretty much they're communicating with people at a distance. They're really touching face to face only a very, very small percentage of their constituents. And I think the same is true for CEOs. And I think in the book that you can sort of look at the Hollander discussion about Obama and the chapter on Steve Jobs, and see how these very, very distant leaders, distant because they're leading huge organizations, about how they sort of manage that and regulate that. So I think that our top-level leaders, we don't have any face time with them. In smaller organizations, then of course we have to balance that. But there are instances, for example, in politics where we're probably never going to meet the people who are leading our state, our country, maybe even our city.
All right. We're about 6 minutes till the end here, and I do have some more questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
One of the questions says, can you speak to the difference between close personal communication and distant communication between followers and leaders, because nonverbal communication behaviors are missing from distance communication?
Okay, since I started out in nonverbal, maybe I should thinking about that a lot. I think what you're seeing is, and obviously, so there are nonverbal channels that aren't available in any kind of electronic communication. But as we move more into, sort of video chats and things like that, then we're bringing back some of those. But I think that's where you see the technology has arisen. So we have the emoticons, as they're called, right? The smiley faces. And you can get a whole range of those. And so really, what there is, there are attempts, and there are lots of attempts out in kind of the artificial intelligence area to try to bring back some of the nonverbal elements to electronic communication. But I think the other thing, too, is I think that people are becoming savvier about the use of electronic communication, and so they're able to put in some of the emotions and put in some of the elements that that are typically missing in the words by how they write, by how they convey, and then again the use of punctuation, if we want to call the emoticons a form of punctuation. So I think that that people are getting very, very savvy in terms of the technology and how they're able to use it to become closer. And in fact, we see lots of times errors that people use. I got an email the other day that was all capital letters from someone, and I said, why is this person shouting at me? So I think that we are able to put some of the elements back, but obviously face-to-face communication offers opportunities to get access to cues that just aren't available in electronic communication.
Yeah, I think it's, I would just add too that I think, some of the technology, I talked a bit about how, distance in and of itself is not inherently good or bad. It's a context. And I think that in some ways, the same really applies to technology, and that often we see this sort of curve of as the technology is introduced, there's, a lot of use of it, and people are, using it in all kinds of contexts that they probably shouldn't have. And as Ron said, we're getting more sophisticated in our choice of media to communicate with both leaders and followers. And I spend a lot of time in my classes talking about when do you choose to send an email, when do you send a text, when do you pick up the phone, when do you video conference, and when is it important to have that face-to-face meeting. And I think that we need to, as leaders and followers, we need to be really sophisticated about, well, what is the efficiency to effectiveness trade-off that we have to make. And if effectiveness is the most important outcome of an interaction, usually face-to-face is still the best media, although not always. And I mentioned, I think that in some cases when there's extreme power differentials between leaders and followers, or when one party feels extremely disadvantaged in some way, sometimes maybe technology can help mediate that. But in most cases, if we really want the richest form of really solid, effective, clear communication, still technology is not a substitute for that in-depth, face-to-face, non-verbally rich kind of interaction. But the reality of the world is that we're getting that less and less with the people that we need to influence the most. And so then the question becomes, how can we really be as persuasive and charismatic as Obama might have been in some of his speeches? Can that be done via technology? And the research tends to say yes, it can, that people are pretty persuaded by mediated speeches, by mediated conversations. And I even point to some of the recent research on text messaging that people actually get an emotional high, if you will, after getting a text message. So, and that's a... Oh, sorry, and that's a very unrich.
Michelle.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have to interrupt you because we're coming to the end of our time.
Sure.
I apologize, but I do want to thank you and Ron for being a part of our webinar today, and for all of you who have participated. Also, I want to thank Malka Goldberg for being our technical director for this webinar. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
And then I just also want to announce that we do have a book giveaway, and so congratulations to Judy Whips, Karen Buchanan, and Mary Graff on winning complimentary copies of Exploring Distance in Leader-Follower Relationships in our book giveaway. So if you're interested in purchasing the book, please refer to the webinar follow-up email for details about a 20% discount from Psychology Press. And again, thank you for participating in today's webinar. Have a great day.